You know, when Muslims express their suspicion that so-called jihadi groups are actually Western mercenaries operating under the auspices of Western intelligence agencies, whether that be in the Middle East or in the Sahel or other parts of Africa or wherever else, this idea is dismissed as a reckless conspiracy theory. We're told that there's no evidence to support such suspicions, as if decades upon decades of historical experience are not evidence enough. I mean, given the reality of the history of the West in the Muslim world and in the global South and in Africa, the claim that actually lacks credibility and lacks proof is the claim that Western personnel are over there for our protection. That's a claim that lacks evidence. And in fact, it's a claim that completely denies both the history of the West in our lands and the very transparent motive for their presence. I mean, tell me, for what possible reason would any Muslim, any African, any Arab, any person at all in the global South, why would they believe for a second that you're using your intelligence agencies and your militaries for any purpose other than for the purpose for which you have always used them in our countries? Destabilization, colonization, exploitation, and plunder. Why would anyone believe that? Where's the evidence that you ever had good intentions? Where's the evidence that you ever cared about our interests and our safety? Where's the evidence that you ever didn't deliberately sow division, violence, and instability? No, this isn't a conspiracy theory. It's learned from lived experience and history. You know, Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, they kicked you out because they knew why you were there all along. And they overthrew their collaborator governments because they knew that they were collaborators. Or what do you want to say, that all of these leaders in the Sahel, they're all conspiracy theorists? Now, these are military men. They're high-ranking officers. You think they didn't know what was going on in their own countries? The French paid tens of millions of euros to these so-called jihadi groups in the Sahel. And it was even reported in their own media, in the French media. And then you have ISIS coming out declaring jihad against what? Hamas? Not against Israel? Why, every rational Muslim in the world knows who these people are. And we know that you're behind it. Everyone knows that. These so-called jihadi groups are nothing but the West's private military contractors. They're your version of Wagner, and everyone knows it. Because you just can't stand for Muslims to get along with each other. And you can't tolerate for Muslims and non-Muslims to get along with each other in the global South. Especially, you can't stand for Muslims and non-Muslims to get along with each other in Africa. The more you lose power, the more you lose influence in Africa, the more China and the more Russia invest in Africa and gain influence through positive means of mutual benefit, the more you intensify your old reliable tactic of violence, rebellion, and promotion of sectarian extremism. Do you think that the people in these regions don't know each other? Do you think that they don't know how alien this type of extremism is to them? And do you think that they're any less familiar with you, with colonizers, with the tactics of colonization? Shame on you. I mean, you literally have in front of your eyes an example of how to deal with Africa, how to deal with the global South in a mature, respectful, harmonious, adult manner. In a manner that's more fair, that's more humane, and that's more decent, in a way that actually benefits local industry, local business, local economies, while also benefiting you. You see China doing that. You see Russia doing that. And that scares you. But there's no reason why you couldn't do that too, except that you're trapped in the old Western supremacist mentality, that colonizer mentality. And so you just fuel violence and division and destabilization. You created this problem. You create all of the problems that you pretend to solve. I mean, almost every single case inside the U.S. and across the West, but especially inside the U.S., almost every case of so-called Islamic terrorism or militancy or extremism or what have you has involved entrapment by intelligence, has involved intelligence agents luring, indoctrinating, encouraging, coercing, and enabling dumb, isolated, emotionally and psychologically unstable and uneducated young Muslims into planning acts of violence. Your so-called war on terror was nothing but a program for manufacturing terrorists. Your war on extremism was a project for creating extremists. This is what you've done in your own countries, and this is what you do in our countries. Because you decided that the new rationale for the wave of colonization over the last 20 years and the wave of domestic controls in the West, the rationale was going to be Islamic extremism. So the only way to make that rationale plausible was to create Islamic extremists, because Islam itself does not create extremists organically, or at least not enough to serve the expansive purposes of your policies. So you manufactured them. You did that in the West, you did it in our countries, and you're doing it right now. So for most of us, when we read stories about so-called jihadis in Africa, in the Sahel, or wherever else, for most of us, what we read is Western colonizer brigades operating under the camouflage of jihadism. Your so-called Muslim extremists have killed Muslims more than anyone else. And you think we can't put two and two together? You know, they mysteriously always seem to advance your agendas. They always achieve somehow your objectives. They always justify your policies of colonization and domination and control. But we're all supposed to ignore all of that and just take you at your word that these groups who consistently serve your interests are actually your enemies and not your agents. And see, it's precisely this way of thinking, this belief that we're so stupid, that we're so gullible, so naive, that's guided and still guides how you deal with us, what you think of us, the disdain that you have for us, why you think we don't deserve to have prosperous economies, don't deserve to benefit, don't deserve sovereignty, and that we don't deserve the natural resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed under our feet. You think, and you're so deluded by your supremacist mentality, that you think that we're just foolish and inferior. And that's why you expect us to believe your nonsense rationales. You insult our intelligence every time you speak. So this is why you can't accept to deal with our countries in an equitable manner, in an honorable, respectable way. Because you think that we're less than you. You think that we're eligible for violent treatment, eligible for subjugation, eligible for poverty and instability. You think we deserve that. And it's some kind of an accident of nature that we happen to inhabit lands with resources that you can't survive without. I mean, you'll even hear them say that, literally. What did the Africans do with their minerals before the Europeans came? What did the Arabs do with their oil before the Europeans came? As if a thief is trying to justify why he stole from someone because he thinks that he could use their money more productively than they did. I mean, use that defense in court. You know, Your Honor, the victim actually had enough money to buy a widescreen television and he failed to do so. That's why I robbed him, because I think that his money was being wasted by him having it. That's your mentality. That's how you think. And it makes sense to you. So yes, we know how you think. We know how you operate. And we know your history. And of course, we know ourselves and our history with you. We know that you want a military presence all around the world, wherever there's resources up for grabs. And we know that conflict, extremism, and strife always accompany your military presence. It's not complicated to understand. In fact, it takes a great deal of discipline to try to force ourselves to not see the obvious and to not acknowledge the obvious, to try to force ourselves to forget history. And by history, I don't mean ancient history. I literally mean just yesterday. And to try to pretend that you're completely different somehow. You're a completely different type of society than what we've always known. A completely different so-called civilization than what you always have been and what we've always experienced from you. It's very difficult to force ourselves to believe that. I mean, maybe you got used to requiring the suspension of disbelief from your audiences in Hollywood movies, that now you can actually expect people to suspend their educated mistrust of your motives. But no, when most of us read jihadis, what we read is Western intelligence, and we don't have to justify that suspicion to you. And frankly, the same goes for almost any type of protest movement that we see these days in the global South, particularly when that protest movement is calling for the overthrow of the government rather than protesting this or that policy. We know that you're involved. If the government isn't a Western client, if the government is a non-aligned government and there are protests, then we know you're involved. For either of us to pretend that you're not involved is actually an insult to the intelligence of both of us. It would be foolish for us to not know that you're involved, first of all, and it would be foolish of you to not be involved, given what we know about your motives and your objectives and your agendas. Everyone needs to just be open about this. I mean, we actually owe it to you as fellow human beings to not let you get away with continuing to pretend that you're civilized and pretend that you're altruistic and pretend that you're sincere, because you're not. And if you still get to be treated as if you are, then you never will be. It isn't enough that your mask has been pulled off. We have to also hold up a mirror to you and make you see yourselves. I think that's what you're probably fighting against the most. And the whole world has to suffer because of your refusal to admit the truth about what you are. Just like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the hypocrites, who become even more severe in their wrongdoing the more you try to advise them. Your denial comes at the cost of excessive bloodshed. You literally committed genocide just to avoid admitting that you're genocidal. You cause violence and insecurity in Africa just so that you can come in and pretend to defend peace and security. You cause division just so that you can assume the role of the mediator between the two parties that you set against each other. And like I said, even when you can see a better example of how to operate, you're incapable of changing. You're incapable of improving, incapable of maturing, because you're stunted by your supremacist mentality. And this mentality is keeping you forever inferior.